Emeritus of Ideation is one of the flashiest magic cards I've ever seen. It's a 5 mana 5/5 for 5 mana with Ward 2. It enters prepared, and prepared means you can cast literal Ancestral Recall. Then, when you attack, you can exile 8 cards from your graveyard to prepare it again to cast another Ancestral Recall, which is basically Treasure Cruise every single turn. I could see this card end up being a huge problem for standard. I could see this card kind of messing that format up. But in modern, it feels like about the right power level. A 5 mana creature that you're actually playing as a 5-drop, it's very, very rare, if ever, that this kind of card makes the cut. Usually your 5 mana creatures like Quantum Riddler, you can cheat into play a little bit earlier, or they're just like totally game ending like Elishnorn. And this I genuinely think might be the first like value 5 mana creature that actually makes the cut in modern. I will say the Ward 2 on this card is a really, really big part of that. I think that this ability is going to be underrated generally, but this card costs a lot of mana, right? It costs 5 mana, but it is also going to cost your opponent extra mana to deal with. So like when you're playing your 5 mana creature, and a lot of times you are going to have to play this on 5 mana and not be able to wait to go this card plus recall in the same turn. When you play this card, if your opponent's going to remove it, it's going to be very difficult. Like it doesn't die to Flage, it doesn't die to most of the red removal spells, it doesn't die to Fatal Push. Like it's not a very easy card to kill. And if you can kill it, you have to spend 2 extra mana. So it's like the mana differential is of like, you play your 5 mana creature and then your opponent plays a removal spell to deal with it. That dynamic of like your 5-drop being really bad because they spend less mana to deal with it, that dynamic is not as pronounced. I will also say modern has been kind of weird lately. Like more and more, I've been finding success with stuff like Ouroborid or Legend of Roku or Phoenix Fleet Airship. Like with how like low to the ground decks like Boros and Prowess and to some extent Affinity are, going over the top of them with a big crazy thing is definitely a real strategy. And so in modern, I think there's 3 ways that you're going to play with this card. You can try to reanimate this card. I think this is probably what I'm most excited for. I've been playing a few different like Dimir and Esper kind of more mid-rangey reanimator decks where you're playing, of course, like Quantum Riddler, and you're playing like Superior Spider-Man Deceit, and you're playing Solitude Ephemerate sometimes, and you're playing Psychic Frog, and Emperor of Bones is pretty mid-rangey. And a lot of times when I play these decks, I kind of feel like the Archon stuff is almost like too high variance. When you reanimate an Archon or an Atraxa, it's going to win you the game. But a lot of times when you're playing these more mid-rangey builds, just these cards getting stuck in your hand is what loses you the game. And the fact that this card is just pretty hard castable in the mid to late game is a huge deal. And this card is also going to take over a game of Modern in a somewhat similar way that Atraxa or Archon does. These cards go over the top of Modern board states, and so does this card. And the fact that it's also good like after you recall, the fact that you get to attack and keep just drawing a lot of cards, I think it's a really big deal. And I'm excited to play some more like mid-rangey reanimator decks that is just genuinely using this and like Superior Spider-Man Deceit as like the top end of the strategy. I also think that like those strategies are going to pair really well with pitch cards. So like you're gonna play Force of Negation, Subtlety, Solitude to kind of let this more slower card engine take advantage of the game with the 0 mana interaction. That being said, I think that you can just play this as a 5 mana card draw spell in like blue-white control. You can just have this be like a 1 or 2 of, I think, at the top end of your curve. If you're playing like a Force of Negation, Subtlety, Solitude, Prismatic Ending, Counterspell deck, you in this kind of build, you won't play 4 copies like you are if you're going to play Reanimator, but I do think 1 or 2 copies in these strategies is going to be viable. And of course, you can try to just ramp this card out with like Mox Opal, Mox Amber strategies. I've been playing a lot of Badger Milk Cup decks. I've been just casting big stuff really fast, and it's been a pretty good formula. I could definitely see playing more of a blue focus build with this card. I've had a few drafts of blue builds that are kind of interesting. This could be a good missing piece. And you could also play a Utopia Sprawl deck, either like Eldrazi and use like K-Command and Talismans to play this a bit faster, or maybe you could be like a 4-color Omnath Shell, and you could try to set up Omnath Fetchland, Emeritus. I think all of this is pretty cool. Again, this is definitely like top end value engine. And one thing I do like about modern post ring ban is you have a lot of really interesting choices for your top end value engine in your decks. Sometimes you're going to choose to play Quantum Riddler over this card. You're going to choose to play Stock Up, Consult the Star Charts, Wan Shi Tong. These are just the blue options. There's a lot of options in other colors, but I think that there are reasons to choose all of these cards. I think this is one really good dynamic of current modern deck building is you just want to choose different card advantage engines for different decks. And I think that this is going to complement that dynamic of Modern. I feel like Wizards of the Coast is baiting me with this card, the Dawning Archaic. It's a 10 mana colorless creature, costs 1 less for each instant or sorcery in your graveyard. So if you have 10 of them in your graveyard, this is a 0 mana 7/7 reach, and when it attacks, you can cast an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. I love this card. This card rules. This card is just screaming to try to break. And there's kind of a lot of ways that you can try to break this card. There's only so many cards I can put on these slides, but I'm the way I'm thinking about this card right now is not probably trying to be like a very aggressive Arc like Pheonix Stimulich deck like you might try to think. I think that getting 10 instants and sorceries in your graveyard is a lot. It's a lot, and it takes a lot of time too. But when you get 8, 9, 10 in your graveyard, this is very, very, very powerful and will take over a game. So the way I'm kind of thinking about this card is that I'm going to want to play it in like an Izzet, maybe Dimir, maybe Grixis control build with stuff like Thought Scour, Dragon Rage's Channeler, Lure and Revealed, Seagate Restoration, and just trying to interact with my opponent while I passively fill up my graveyard with my cantrips, with Lure and Revealed, with Channeler, Surveils. And then I'm going to play this, and then flashing back Lure and Revealed is insane. Flashing back Seagate Restoration is insane. You can flash back removal spells if you need them, etc., etc. Now, and I think that this is going to be very cool and interesting. A 10 mana 7/7 also dodges most removal in the format. It really only gets Solitude. It dodges Heat, dodges Discharge most of the time. It dodges Flage plus Arena even. It dodges Fatal Push, of course. And so I think that dynamic is really interesting. And so this is going to be the first place I try it. Is going to be like probably Izzet Control Shell with like Scour, Channeler, Lure and Revealed, and having this be my top end. Now, there are a lot of other interesting things you can do with this card. It imprints to Ugin's Labyrinth. What does that mean? I don't know. I don't know how you can build in like a deck that's so full of instants and sorceries that also wants to play Ugin's Labyrinth and plays this card. Maybe it's like you have Malevolent Rumble and K Command in Eldrazi. Beyond that, your options are kind of limited. Maybe you could play Ancient Stirrings. I would love to play an Ugin's Labyrinth Dawning Archaic deck. That would be the coolest thing ever. It's not going to be really early on my to-do list. I'm going to start. So like one thing, this is maybe good to talk about now. With the brewing process, I like to try a lot of times to just maximize the card. Try to just play like a more normal deck with it that is really built around it, a more normal archetype. And then I can start to understand this card better. And then we can get really weird with like Ugin's Lab, K Command, Otherworldly Gaze, Arclight Pheonix, Stimulich, if we feel like it meets those requirements from the earlier build. So this is the card I'm most excited for. I'm sorry if I waste your time with this, but I'm going to spend a lot of time on this card. So there's 5 new charms in the set. I love charms. Charms I think are really cool. I think all 5 are interesting in Modern, although I do think Witherbloom Charm is kind of by far the best one. Maybe not by far, but by a pretty good bit. It's a Golgari charm, green and black. You can choose one. You can sack a permanent. If you do, draw 2 cards. You can gain 5 life, which I think this is really nice. Like, 5 life for 2 mana is very situational that you would want to do this, but a somewhat powerful situational effect on a charm is always really cool. Just this is going to sometimes be able to stabilize you against like Prowess and Boros in a spot where you just wouldn't have access to life gain like this otherwise. And then the best mode on this card is destroy target non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less. This ability is really, really good when combined with these other 2 modes. Like this, it's basically Abrupt Decay. There are a few 3 mana stuff that you want to be hitting, like Flage, Teferi Time Raveler, Spelunking are a few cards that come to mind. But for the most part, you get all the goodness of a 2 mana removal spell that's dealing with, Guides, Prides, Ragavans, Tomios, etc. But this also hits Amulet of Vigor, Goblin Bombardment, Ruby Medallion, Flip to Johnny, Expedition Map if you're on the play. It kills Cori Steelcutter, which is such a big deal. It kills all the other creatures out of Prowess, kills Talisman. This is a huge deal. And the fact, I love cards that are combination very efficient removal and then also situational card draw. I think like the easiest thing is just going to be sack like an Orc token. So you can, if you're just playing Orcish Bowmaster with Witherbloom Charm, is just going to be like a 2-mana instant speed draw 2 for the most part. If you have a Bowmaster. But also if your opponent just kills any of your creatures, you can sack it, draw 2 cards. That's going to be a good situation. And so like you have a good removal, you have strong-ish card draw, And then you also have situational life gain. I think this card rules. I think that this is like a real reason to be a Golgari midrange deck. I've been playing a lot of black-based midrange decks in Modern over the last 2 years. We've had some good success. A lot of times they're mono black. Mono black has been by far the most successful, probably followed by like black splashing colorless for K Command, followed by Rakdos, and then there's just very few reasons to be Golgari. Tarmogoyf stinks. The Urza Saga value plan doesn't even require you to be green, but is also not very good in this archetype anymore. Witherbloom Charm is a real reason to beat Golgari midrange in Modern again, and that's really exciting. This is probably a good time to say this too. I am so excited for this set because it is full of instants and sorceries and non-legendary creatures that you build around. All of the Universe Beyond sets that are just 80 legendary creatures, I am so tired of them. I am so tired of sets that have 80 plus legendary creatures. This set is just a really nice breath of fresh air. The original Strixhaven set gave us Expressive Iteration, which was for a pretty long time the best card draw spell in Modern. Now we have what is maybe an improvement, although maybe a side grade, in Flow State. It's a mono blue card, blue and colorless. This is really nice. This means that you're not locked in Izzet colors to have this kind of effect. You can play Dimir, Simic, Azurius, etc. And so it has a very similar effect. You look at the top 3 cards of your library, you put one of them to your hand. Now, in order to get a second card, you have to have an instant and a sorcery in your graveyard. Not instant or sorcery, instant and sorcery. If you do, you can put any 2 cards into your hand here. One really big thing about this works better with counter spells than Expressive Iteration. You know, if you're playing a counterspell deck, Iteration is pretty awkward because yes, you can put 1 counterspell into your hand. If you get 2 counterspells, you can't really use both of them on your turn. This one doesn't have that problem. This one also doesn't give any information to your opponent. Pretty minor, but somewhat relevant. This one is like, I guess this part's not really real, but in theory, on turn 2, you could draw 2 cards with this, which you can't really do very often with Iteration unless you hit Mishra's Bauble. It's not really very possible to have an instant and a sorcery in your graveyard, at least not consistently. Sometimes you're going to go Channeler Bauble and get lucky. Maybe you're playing a Faithless Looting deck and you discard an instant. That is kind of interesting, and like that might be a thing, but for the most part, I think Flow State like weirdly comes online about the same turn Iteration does. It's but it also kind of only does that if you're curving out. And if you're curving it out with instants and sorceries, which is like a pretty big downside compared to Iteration. So one thing that I think is kind of interesting is you can play both of these. I think Prowess is going to be interested in playing both of these. I think Prowess is a great example of a deck with a good number of sorceries, a lot of instants, and gets them in the yard really quickly. And I think is interested in like, maybe not the full 8, but probably like 5 to 7 of this effect, I think is very valid. And I think this card is another great tool for deck building. I don't think it's going to be a big game changer to the format in a similar way that Expressive Iteration is not a big game changer to the format. But like I mentioned earlier, there's just like so many like cool and interesting card advantage engines in the format. And I think all of a sudden we have like a bigger engine with this Expressive Iteration Flow State package. Mind into Matter, I think, is a very dangerous card. I think a lot of players are going to really underrate this, by the way. If you're looking for, maybe I'm going to call this as the one thing that other players are, I think other players are going to think this card is bad, and I think this card is actually going to see a lot of play across multiple formats. So this is 2 mana X, green and blue. Draw X cards, then put a permanent card with mana value X or less from your hand into the battlefield tapped. So with Mind into Matter, this card breaks the usual downside of drawing a bunch of cards in Magic the Gathering. Drawing a bunch of cards is great. Card advantage is a great way to win a game and just have a lot more to do than your opponent. The problem with drawing cards is when you spend a bunch of mana to draw a bunch of cards, you're not doing anything and you can kind of fall behind on board. Mind into Matter lets you do something. You can spend 5 mana, draw 3 cards, and put a 3-drop into play. You can spend 4 mana, put a 2-drop into play. 6 mana, put a 4-drop into play. And like this may be a bigger deal in Standard, but I think it might just play way better than you would expect, because this fundamentally breaks the downside of drawing cards. It lets you put a permanent into play and not fall as far behind on board as you usually would for an effect like this. Like this card is like quietly very power crept. And again, this might just be more of a standard thing than a modern thing, but there is some interesting stuff you can do within modern. Like one, we've been doing a lot of badger moling, and this card seems good to just like put stuff like badger mole into play and also ramp into with badger mole. You could also just put a Lotus Bloom into play. Maybe you spend 3 mana, put a Bloom into play. You could spend 2 mana, just put a Bloom into play, then cast Mind into Matter, draw 4 cards, and next turn put something else into play. I think that's kind of interesting. Kind of reminds me of Portent of Calamity, which is like a fringe card. Draw some cards early, cast a big thing late. But where I think this card is actually dangerous for modern is in Amulet of Vigor decks. Amulet of Vigor tends to like sometimes play stock up in the 75 for a card selection, card advantage tool to grind through interaction. I think this card is way, 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 way better than that. One, Amulet is a deck that's capable of making, countless amounts of mana by as soon as turn 2, but usually by turn 3 with Amulet of Vigor. Amulet of Vigor is also a card that is notorious for putting this line of text, this downside, into permanent into play tapped into an upside. This does let you put lands into play. This can be played as a 3 mana explore, as a 2 mana play an extra land, but you don't get to draw an extra card, which can just be like you can just ramp with this card on turn 2 in Amulet, and on turn 3 you could also just spend 8 mana, draw 6 cards, and put a Primeval Titan into play, and then you also have 5 more cards in your hand, and then when your Primeval Titan enters, you get to make extra mana, and then you got 5 cards to spend that mana on. Like I think that this card is going to be a really cool card to brew with in modern, but it's going to be the best in Amulet Titan, and I'm probably not going to spend much time brewing with this card in Amulet Titan. It's just not the kind of deck I enjoy playing, but I think this card probably is great there. I think this card is probably very, very scary there. Also, like one thing, if you have a basic forest and your opponent has a Harbinger of the Seas in play, you could just cast this for a bunch and then try to put a Titan into play. That way, it's like, I think this card is nuts in that deck. You just get to make so much mana so fast, and I don't know, maybe I'm totally wrong, but I will say don't sleep on this card. I think that this card just does something powerful and unique that you don't really see very often. Oh, also, okay, there's a lot of X spells in this set. I'm gonna pull up a card. So there's Roshin Roaring Prophet, 4 mana 4/4. When it enters, you can mill 6, and you can put a card with mana value X from it into your hand, and you can tap it to reveal any number of cards with mana value X, and then you add 2 colorless for each card revealed this way. And so, like, I've wanted to build around this card for a long time, a lot of times with, like, shifting woodlands. You can just woodland, tap, make a bunch of mana. And so, Mind of the Matter is one card that could be interesting built around Roshin. There are a lot of X spells in this set, so just kind of keep this card in mind. It's a 2 mana instant with X in the casting cost. You get to draw 2 cards and then discard a card, and you also get to deal X damage to any target. Now, you might think, 2 mana X Fireball. Fireballs are bad. You have to spend 3 mana to deal 1 damage, 4 mana to do 2 damage, etc. But I think what's kind of easy to miss about this card is that draw 2, discard a card is actually just pretty good in modern. It's pretty rare. Tainted Indulgence is a modern card that sees play. This card is an Is It Tainted Indulgence, which is maybe a bit worse because black is the reanimator color and Is It isn't. But this is Tainted Indulgence with X deal X damage. That's kind of crazy. I think when you are taking a modern playable effect and you also just add deal X damage, your top deck's going to be way better. You're way better dealing with stuff like Ragavan, Ocelot, Pride. If you are playing like a focused graveyard strategy and your opponent's hating your graveyard, all of a sudden you just have a bunch of fireballs in your deck. I think it's interesting. This card also flips Tomio turn 2, discards stuff like Flage to value and like Jeskai control decks. I think this card rules, and this card also looks super fun. It's like, Strixhaven is so exciting because every single card, it looks good and fun. I'm just over the moon with this set. I think Emeritus of Conflict is kind of going to be like Cori Steelcutter's sidekick in modern. Cori Steelcutter is the most important card in a lot of modern decks, or at least is it Metalcraft and Prowess and some brews over at twitch.tv/aspiringspike. And Emeritus of Conflict is like, it works really well with Cori Steelcutter, and it's wanting you to do a lot of the same things you're already doing anyways in these Steelcutter decks. It's a 2 mana 2/2 first strike. The first strike on this card is pretty good, blocks Ragavan without dying, etc., etc. And whenever you cast your 3rd spell each turn, this card becomes prepared, and you get to cast Lightning Bolt. And Lightning Bolt that you can cast potentially multiple times, although your opponent's probably going to be dead pretty quick, is pretty good in Cori Steelcutter decks. And it kind of gives you like a secondary payoff for playing a bunch of spells each turn. Excited to play this in Prowess and in Metalcraft, and we'll probably end up in a few different brews too. Over the years, we've played lots of Boros, Mono Red, Gruul, land destruction decks. Usually in modern land destruction decks are called Ponza. I think Maelstrom Artisan is kind of huge for these archetypes, specifically in Boros. It's a 3 mana 3/2, it enters prepared. You can spend 2 mana to play this card, Rocket Volley, which destroys a non-basic land. And I don't know, I just kind of love this card. You can play it relatively cheaply on turn 3, set up to blow up a land the next turn, hopefully, and then just keep ephemerating it and felling it over and over and over again to blow up your opponent's non-basic lands. I like that it's non-basic instead of basic. I think that that's an interesting dynamic about how your opponent's going to fetch and try to maneuver around this. And I just think it's an awesome tool. Like, this kind of doesn't really exist right now, like a cheap creature that you can flicker to Stone Rain. Now it's not, maybe I'm overrating it because of like it's 3 mana and you can start blowing up lands, but you have to spend an extra 2 mana to blow up your opponent's lands whenever you do, right? So it's kind of a 5 mana card, and which is just kind of hard to evaluate. It's hard to evaluate these prepared cards when you haven't played with them. That being said, I'm really happy to spend 2 mana to blow up an opponent's land basically anytime, you know? Like, anytime I'm going to Felia this or Ephemerate this, I'm going to be happy to set it up. One issue maybe is, like, when you Felia the Artisan, you can't Rocket Volley till next turn. That could end up being a pretty big issue. I don't know, but I'm optimistic about this card. I think it can be a pretty important piece for these Boros decks to interact with a lot of the linear strategies. And this is just good against, like, it's good against Titan, it's good against Tron, it's good against Belcher. It's probably pretty good against Storm. They do play a lot of non-basics, and it's just kind of good against all of these bigger decks. Maybe it's not that good against Storm. I said that, and I think it's probably too slow. I take that one back. But it's a good way to interact with combo decks as like a Boros like mid-range deck, and then you can just side out of this if you're playing against like Boros Prowess, and go a bit more big and a bit more controlling, if that makes sense. I like this card a lot. Vane's New Dean. It's a 3 mana 2/1 flying. Whenever it enters, you make a 1/1 token, and whenever it attacks, you gain 1 life, which helps this next ability. At the beginning of your end step, if you've gained life this turn, you return up to 1 creature card, mana value X or less, from your graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the amount of life you've gained this turn. I think it fits really well in this black-white combo / mid-range deck I've been working on. This is trying to Cauldron, Agatha's Cauldron, a Walking Ballista onto a Leonardo, which lets you deal infinite damage, and is also just kind of passively playing Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride, Ranger Captain, that whole package, and the Overlord Felia package, and kind of gets tied together with Emperor of Bones, since if you put a counter on this with Grange or Cauldron, you can reanimate extra stuff. Maybe this card is better than Emperor of Bones. Maybe it replaces some other value pieces. Maybe you're going to play a split, but this deck gains a lot of life. This deck puts stuff in the graveyard with Overlord and Ranger Captain sacrificing, and this deck is interested in recurring your Guide of Souls, recurring your Ocelot Pride, recurring your Leo, recurring your Ranger Captain. I think all of that's pretty good, and you're not going to play like more than like probably 2 copies of this, but I think it fits really well, and I think it's also just going to be a pretty dang fun card. Expedition Tidecaller is a very, very interesting enabler. It's a 1 mana 0/2. It says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, target player mills 3 cards. If 5 or more mana was spent to cast that, target player mills 10. I don't think that mode is going to be particularly relevant, although I guess it could possibly come up if you're playing like a Dawning Archaic deck and you're flashing back Lore and Revealed and Seagate Restoration. But my main idea with this card is that you're going to be milling yourself. You could do this in sort of a normal Crabvine deck, although the problem with those decks is you're not playing that many instants and sorceries. So I'm kind of reminded of this Artist Talent Dredge deck that's with Arclight Pheonix that we were working on. This deck ended up going some places, was top hitting some events. I was pretty happy that it kind of took off. But if you're going to be playing this kind of Arclight Pheonix deck where you want to be dumping stuff in your graveyard for your Phoenixes and get your Dredge stuff going, while you're also already playing Lava Dart and Faithless Looting, and if you're playing this card, you're probably also going to play Otherworldly Gaze. It just seems like a great tool to dump stuff in your graveyard, mill over Lava Dart, flashback Lava Dart, keep going. I think it's pretty interesting. Maybe it'll end up being better than Artist Talent, although Artist Talent's really crazy in this deck, so maybe not. But I think it's a great fit here. I think it's possibly a good enabler for just normal Arclight Pheonix Stimulus decks, which you all know I'm pretty interested in. And I think it's also possibly a good enabler for the Dawning Archaic decks. Is it going to be one you want to play in the control archetypes? Maybe. Is it going to be one that you can use to try to make this card like actually just like really fast and really powerful? Also, maybe. Maybe you could also pair this with just Hedron Crab, and you have 4 Tidecallers, 4 Crabs, and you're using this to self-mill to try to play some combination of Dawning Archaic and Lich Arc like Pheonix. I'm excited for that. This card also just looks super fun. I'm so excited. Now, I think that Tidecaller is going to be probably better for the Pheonix Dredge deck than Muse Seeker, but Muse Seeker is pretty interesting. Kind of reminds me of Sandwith Steel Seeker. It's a 2-mana 1/2. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card, and then discard a card unless 5 or more mana was spent to cast a spell. That part's not really relevant. It's basically cast instant or sorcery, draw a card, discard a card. Pretty unique. I don't believe that there is an effect like this, especially so cheap. Seems like potentially really good in this kind of shell. I think it's also possible you could play this in a different shell that's going a bit bigger, but it's kind of hard to imagine that you're playing a deck that cares about casting a lot of cheap instants and sorceries and you're not playing prowess, and I wouldn't play this in prowess. So a very interesting tool. This might be the kind of card that like it may get busted one day and is maybe just not busted now, if that makes sense. It's also maybe kind of interesting in ephemerate decks. Like, you can ephemerate this just to draw a card, discard a card twice, but you can also target something else and then get this extra effect there too. I don't know. I'm optimistic that I'll find a home for this one day, but it does kind of feel like one that's just not going to be a card I build a deck with very fast. I might forget about it, but like maybe in like 3 sets this card's broken. I think I like Scheming Silvertongue. I'm not really super sure. It's a 1-mana 1/3 flying lifelink. Not bad stats, like blocks a lot of the Boros creatures pretty well. And flying is also really, really important in like the Boros Slickshot show-off metagame too. It says, at the beginning of your second main phase, if you gain 2 or more life this turn, this creature becomes prepared. So if you're attacking with the lifelink part, that's 1 of the life, and it's kind of easy to get the other 1 life with like Guide of Souls, All-Star Pride, maybe Sorin. Sorin's pretty interesting with all of these care about gaining life black cards from Silver Quill, because this cares a lot about gaining life. So I think we might see a deck that's pretty built around these effects and Sorin. I'm really hoping. But it seems pretty easy to do that, and you get to cast Sign in Blood, a card that I do register in Modern occasionally. Target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. This has some synergy with stuff like Orcish Bowmaster and Shieldred, where you can target your opponent and just deal them some extra damage to kill them. But it just seems like a pretty okay card advantage engine. I'm a little bit worried that like when you prepare this card, if you get it prepared, you're going to really feel like you have to cast Sign in Blood immediately, because if you don't, this dies and then you lose your card draw spell. And so maybe like the tempo there is awkward, where you want to dump your hand first, but like I don't want to lose my Sign in Blood. So I think that dynamic's kind of weird, but it might just be a powerful enough modern card when paired with these cards on your left. So I mean, I'm optimistic for this one. Probably a little less optimistic for it than some other cards in the list, but I do think it has like high upside. Another really fun 3-mana sorcery. 3 mana, put a +1 counter on each creature target player controls, then target creature of your choice gains double strike or lifelink until end of turn. Now, you're not going to want to cast the front side of this very often. It will be like just a good top deck sometimes to win you the game, but for the most part, I think you want to be discarding this to value, to stuff like Faithless Looting and Fear of Missing Out, and using this as a way to just push a bunch of damage through. Now, I've played a bunch of like Boros Delirium, which instead of using like Guide Pride of Johnny, uses like Channeler, Fear of Missing Out, Cori Steelcutter, and you're like discarding Flage really aggressively to like Arena of Glory Flage. Like Dragon Rage's Channeler Flage, I think is just generally pretty underexplored. I think this card fits in really, really well in that kind of shell. There's also another upgrade from that archetype later in this video, but I think this card just fits great there. A 1 counter on each creature in like a Cori Steelcutter deck is going to go pretty crazy. And then I like that you could either get more, maybe defensive is not, you can stabilize easier with the lifelink, or you can get more aggressive with the double strike. I think that's cool. And just having more stuff to discard for value besides Flage and Detective's Pheonix, I think is something that archetype really wanted. So I think it's going to fit in there pretty well. Okay, I'm just going to talk about the other card for this Boros Delirium deck now. It's Lordhold Charm, probably doesn't come as a big surprise. Like all the charms, it's got 3 modes. The first mode, pretty nice, although kind of narrow. Each opponent sacrifices a non-token artifact of their choice. So one thing that's really nice is for this Boros Delirium deck, for normal Boros energy, you're really weak to Leyline Scion of Draco. That is a big, you're pretty fragile to the flying, vigilance, lifelink, first striker. But just being able to make them sacrifice it is great. It also can deal with Amulet of Vigor. It can also deal with Ruby Medallion. A lot of like cheap build around artifacts like this. Now this is the real mode that you really like here. Return artifact or creature card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard. Historically, I like to play Recommission to like return my Cori Steelcutters and my Dragon Range's Channelers, my Fear of Missing Outs. And it's nice that this card can also buy back Flage for like for a Helix or Seasoned Pyromancer. But I think I'd rather play this. I do really like that it gets back Cori Steelcutter, but having the removal versatility, similar degree of reanimation, and also this ability, creatures get +1/+1 till trample. This is awesome. This card says sometimes win the game, and you don't have to choose that mode. It could be removal, proactive threat, or just steal a game, or maybe you play 2 of them and you just totally crush your opponent. I think this card is really nice. One thing you could do with Cori Steelcutter if you have 4 mana is you can just do creatures get +1/+1, and then hold priority before that one resolves. Play a second copy, then you get a Steelcutter token, and then everything gets the +1/+1 trample. So really excited for this card. Now, this card does also go in normal Boros energy, maybe. I do think it's better in the Delirium shell, which is a shell we have had some good success with because of the desire to be able to reanimate stuff. And you can also get just kind of loot it away if it's not particularly effective, which is also nice. So I'm excited for this card in this shell. I'm not very excited for Boros energy to like no longer be. Also, I guess for one thing for Boros energy too is Boros energy is also weak to Amulet, Storm, and Leyline Scion. And so the fact that it's good against all of these 3 things it's probably not great for the modern format. We're going to give Mana Sculpt a try. It is a 3 mana instant counter target spell. If you control a wizard, you add an amount of colorless mana equal to the amount of mana spent to cast that spell at the beginning of your next main phase. It's kind of like a mana drain Flame of Anor in the sense that you need a wizard in play to trigger this. It's pretty easy to get a wizard in play in Modern in 2025. There's just a lot of good cheap wizards. I'm not going to list them all or put them up here. We don't need to go that deep in there. But your ability to turn this into a 3 mana drain is pretty interesting. Building your deck around this is very difficult. Stuff like K Command, Wan Shitong, Quantum Riddler, all of these. I guess I'm just gonna add these to the slide. There you go. Like mana sculpting into these cards, it all seems pretty interesting, although none of these cards are wizards. So like maybe that dynamic is just not going to be able to be realized. It kind of reminds me of Invert Polarity. It's a 3 mana counter spell that you get like a big extra effect on, right? And you only get it some of the time. With Mana Sculpt, you only get it if you control a wizard. With Invert Polarity, you only get to steal their spell if you win the flip. With Mana Sculpt, you have control over when you get the effect, right? With Invert Polarity, you don't. This card is really, really insane every time you win the flip. And you might see like kind of a similar dynamic with Mana Sculpt, where this card is just incredible every time you counter a spell with a wizard in play. And so I'm willing to give it a try because you just get to, it's a similar effect as Polarity. Polarity tested very well, but it was just too high variance. And then with Mana Sculpt, you get to reduce or control the variance on this kind of effect. So I think this card could end up being quite strong. I think it's likely not going to be that big a deal though. Although I hope it is because it's really fun and I like to play wizards. A lot of people in my Twitch chat have been kind of down on this card. That is my entire gauge for the Magic community. So I think people don't like this card. But I do like it. It's a 3 mana 3/3. When it enters, target player makes a 1/1 token with flying. Then if an opponent controls more creatures than you, this becomes prepared. So it's nice that this is a way to prepare it if you're just equal on creatures after this card enters. It is also, 2 bodies, 4 power for 3 mana. It's not embarrassing, although not particularly good either. And if it's prepared, you get Swords to Plowshares. It's a good card. It exiles a thing for 1 mana. And I was kind of thinking that this card is actually pretty dang reasonable because of the decks that are in the format right now. Also at Pride, Pinnacle Emissary, Cori Steelcutter, Ajani. These just put a lot of creatures into play. If you're playing Emeritus of Truce, you probably don't have as many creatures in play as your opponent does, or at least in a lot of these matchups. And it is kind of cool if you're playing against a deck without a lot of creatures, you can just, it is still 4 power at least, and you can also reset this with Ephemerate, Felia, keep making tokens and keep casting Swords of Plowshares against these decks that put a lot of creatures into play. And so I would be a lot lower on this card if this wasn't a Pinnacle Emissary, Cori Steelcutter, Ajani, Ocelot Pride format, but it is, so I think I'll put this in some decks. got a pretty weird uncommon in Fractal Anomaly. It's a 1-mana instant. You make a token with X counters on it, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn. There's potentially a lot of applications for this in like Faithless Looting Street Wraith decks, but the Faithless Looting Street Wraith deck that I'm interested in playing it in is Vivi Cauldron. This is an archetype that I have a winning record with over several iterations, several like set releases, and I think is kind of an underrated strategy in Modern. It's like the same combo as Standard, which is banned in Standard, but you have some absurd enablers for the archetype with like Street Wraith, Faithless Looting. You can play Dragon Rage's Channeler sometimes. Fate Stitcher is bananas in the deck. Fate Stitcher is like quietly like maybe the biggest deal as like far as like Standard to Modern goes, being able to untap your Cauldron on your combo turns, and then also goes infinite with Grand and Cauldron. It's a really a big deal. Now, this deck is focused on drawing a lot of cards and making mana with creatures with counters on it. This enters with counters, so if you have a Cauldron on Vivi, you get to make a bunch of mana, and this is a deck that's playing Faithless Looting, Street Wraith, Winter Night Stories, Proph's Idyllic Memory, Fear of Missing Out, some Casey Jones, and so this is also just going to be a big guy, and so being a big guy against like hate cards is also pretty good. It's an instant, which is weird and interesting. I like this card a lot, and I'm going to be trying it in this archetype, although it probably will not be a 4 of, although we'll see. Harmonized Trio is a very fun card. I don't think it's very likely to be good in Modern, but it has some potential. It's a 1-mana 1/1. You can tap it and 2 other creatures to prepare it, and you can prepare a copy of Brainstorm. Brainstorm is a pretty good card. You can draw 3 cards. You can put 2 on top of your library. It does a lot of stuff. Well, I guess it does exactly that, but it works really well with stuff like Tamio, Counterbalance, and Fetch Lands, fetching away 2 bad cards after you put them back on top. Tapping 2 other creatures it's a pretty high cost. It's a pretty high cost. You could possibly play this in Merfolk, but Merfolk will probably still be very bad. But I do think this card is interesting with Tamio, where like Tamio is another cheap creature that you can tap to Harmonized Trio. And if you can make a Brainstorm, you can flip Tamio. I think that's interesting. I think it's also interesting that you can like Brainstorm with Counterbalance in play, put a spell with the same mana value as whatever your opponent cast, and then counter that spell with Counterbalance. And then if your opponent plays another spell, you can tap Trio and then prepare again and Brainstorm again. So I'm going to do that on stream to get it out of my system. I'm going to see if this card has potential. And I'm like, the upside is there. It's a 1-mana creature that can cast Brainstorm every turn. But needing to tapping 2 other creatures, it's very high cost. So I don't exactly expect this card to be good, but I really like it. I'm going to cast it. All right, Jadzi, Steward of Fate, pretty interesting card. 3-mana 2/4. 4 toughness is very good in Modern, not so much because of Lightning Bolt, although a little bit because of Lightning Bolt with prowess, but because it doesn't die to Flage. When you play your 3-mana creature and it just dies to Flage, it sucks so much. But 4 toughness, like, it doesn't die to Flage. And like this is a real dynamic in Modern where if you're curving out with your opponent, your 3-drop has 4 toughness, your opponent's 3-drop is Flage. All of a sudden that is a way to get ahead against Boros, where their 3-drop is just awkward against yours. But it's a 3-mana 2/4. When it enters, you draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards. You can use this in a lot of ways in Modern. You can discard Flage for value. You can flip Tamio. There's a lot of cards you can discard for value. Blah, 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 blah. And then it also comes with a pretty interesting second half here. You make X fractal tokens that are 0/0s base, and you put X counters on each of them. So for 3 mana, you get a 1/1. It's not very good. For 5 mana, you get 2 2/2s. It's not so bad. For 7 mana, you get 3 3/3s, etc. And so it's kind of cool that you have a card that's like reasonable early, and they have to kill it because it's going to take over the game. And I think it fits really well in this deck I've been working on. This is like a Jeskai control shell that's trying to use Faithless Looting as a card draw engine. And so you're discarding either like Oculus or like Unearth or Helping Hand, or you're discarding Flage for value. And this does that too. And is I don't know. I think it's just pretty interesting. I don't know exactly like what the split is or how it fits or how many numbers, but I think I'll play it in this shell eventually. There's a lot to get to with the set. It's going to take a while. Also, Obosh deck. Skycoach Conductor is a pretty interesting card. It's a 3-mana 2/3 Flash Vigilance. The Vigilance on this is pretty nice, although it's kind of a bummer that it doesn't block a jump to Guide of Souls very effectively. But it enters prepared, and the prepared is a 1 mana flicker, kind of like Ephemerate, except it can't target pilots. So you can't flicker itself, which would be really broken because you would just, your opponent would target with removal spell, you flicker it with all aboard, and that just goes off forever. But I think it's kind of cool that it's an ephemerate effect that you can kind of store. I like that it has flash. This works really well in various Quantum Riddler decks. It's a blue flicker effect for Quantum Riddler decks, which sometimes can be a point of conflict if you're like Dimir or maybe Simic, like you just don't have a good flicker effect. And it can also be hit off Collected Company, which you might not think is that relevant, but we did recently play Collected Company and do pretty well with it with 2 different builds. And I don't know, I think it's an interesting tool, unlikely to be a pretty big deal, but it is one that like I think will end up in some decks kind of incidentally. I'm not going to go out and build a deck around this, but I think it will make a slot in like a 1 or 2 of in some decks. Okay, this card, Petrified Hamlet, is really, really cool. It's a land. When it enters, you choose a land name, and then activated abilities of that name can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. And then lands with the chosen name have tap, add a colorless. So one thing is if your opponent plays a fetch land, you play this. It is a trigger. They can respond to the trigger with a fetch land. This doesn't just Pithy Needle fetch lands, like I've seen some people suggest that they do. But this effect is good against stuff like Urza Saga. It can be good against fetch lands. If you know your opponent is like really heavy on color requirements and you're main decking this, you'll just name Scalding Tarn against like Prowess, and then colorless lands kind of suck for them. You can name Beseiju, Otawara, T-West, Woodland. Mostly Titan is a deck with all the activated ability lands, but it is a nice disruptive tool in those matchups. But the cool thing that this card does is if you're like playing against Boros, you can name Sacred Foundry. If you're playing against Prowess, you can name Steam Vents. And then all of a sudden, your Obsidian Charmals cost 1 less for each one of those lands that they have in play. So if you can make Obsidian Charmal a 3 mana, 4 mana, or sometimes 2 mana 4/4 that destroys non-basic land, that's really good. Although, with the Hamlet, you're kind of always adding 1 to the cost because you probably are going to tap this to cast the Charmal for whatever that's worth. It also does work with Break the Ice in the same way, although it's kind of cool that you can go like Urborg into Hamlet plus Break the Ice, but it's like you kind of need these 3 cards to assemble a 2 mana Stone Rain. But I think that that's cool. I think it's fun. I've actually kind of like daydreamed about this effect for Charmal for a long time. Just if I could only make my opponent's lands tap for colorless, that would be so cool. And now you can do that. And so I'll definitely play it. I don't necessarily expect it to be great, but it could play better than you might think. I think it could certainly end up being good, but we'll just have to play with it to find out. And of course, it's nice that like it is also good against other stuff. Okay, this card is pretty narrow. Withering Curse gives -2/-2 till end of turn to all creatures and destroys all creatures instead if you've gained life this turn. It's pretty narrow, but it's pretty powerful. Like, I like that it kills like Emry and a Pinnacle Emissary tokens early, and then it kills Kappa Cannoneer if you can gain life. I think that's a pretty big deal. It's obviously good against the cheap prowess creatures. And I think that like you do have a decent number of ways to gain life in black decks. Cling to Dust is kind of the big one, although when you Cling to Dust a creature and then you cast this, you're kind of turning it into a damnation, but it's like a 3 mana sweeper early and then maybe a more expensive sweeper late. Maybe there is like this kind of black life gain deck with these new cards where Sorin is a pretty big piece of this. And I think one thing that's kind of cool with Sorin is like if you like attack with it, you gain life, then you get to flip it, and then you get to Withering Curse, and then your Sorin lives. I think that's kind of interesting. So a really fun deck building tool. A very fun, narrow deck building tool. I love to see cards like this. Flashback. It's Snapcaster Mage, giving an instant or sorcery in your graveyard, flashback till end of turn, but just with no body. It's just 1 red mana, target card gains flashback. This card does a lot. You can obviously just do normal stuff like flashback your Lightning Bolt, flashback your Counterspell, flashback your Consult the Star charts. And I think that might just be good. Snapcaster being 2 mana to play a card from the graveyard has been not so good for quite some time. I do think Snapcaster is sometimes a little bit playable. Sometimes I play it in like Dimir Flash. Sometimes I'll play it in Wizard Shells. But the big thing with Snapcaster Mage not being so good is that a 2/1 body is really irrelevant in a way that it didn't used to be. Like a 2/1 creature when Snapcaster was a modern staple, it was a real card. Your opponent had to kind of respect it. It like blocked Dark Confidant and blocked Goblin Guide. Now a 2/1, it just like it gets ignored by Ocelot Pride, Goblin Bombardment, Pinnacle Emissary, Lava Dart. No one cares about just a random 2/1 really. And so it's like you get the same effect, and you get it for one less. And obviously you don't hate having a 2/1 body, but this is like maybe this effect is just good because it costs one less. We'll see. I'm really excited to test that. It does some like other interesting stuff beyond just being I flashback my removal spell, my counter spell, or my card draw spell. It seems like it's probably very good in Cori Steelcutter decks, period, where whenever you flashback anything, you trigger Cori Steelcutter. And one thing that's kind of fun is if you draw multiples, you can go flashback my flashback a different flashback, and flashback another spell, Like you could potentially just chain some together for just a bunch of prowess triggers. And so obviously you can play that in normal prowess. Maybe you can get weird with it in a different like Murktide Shell where you're doing both things, where you're using flashback as an interactive / card draw spell and also a Cori Steelcutter enabler. I do think Steelcutter is good in Murktide. And maybe this card's good in Storm too. I think it's kind of interesting that like when you're going off, it can either be a card draw spell or a ritual, although it's not a very good ritual, but it is still like spend 2 mana, get 1, which is sometimes what you need. And so like I think you would play 1 or 2 in Storm probably. But I like this card a lot. I'm really excited for it. Strixhaven this set just rules. Okay, I've got this vision for Tablet of Discovery. It's a 3-mana artifact. When it enters, you mill a card. You may play that card this turn. It taps for a red mana, or you can make 2 red mana and cast only instants and sorcery spell. So a 3-mana artifact that when it enters, you can draw a card kind of, and you can make 2 mana only for instants and sorceries. But let's say this: 3-mana artifact enters, draw a card, tap, make 2 mana. That card's crazy. You have to build around it. And so I have this vision of playing it with Boombust, Price of Freedom, Cleansing Wildfire, where you can just kind of play it, hopefully hit one of these, tap it, cast the spell, and then, cast Price of Freedom, boom, Wildfire. And then also, if you play this on turn 3, on turn 4, you can play Bust and just blow up all of your opponent's lands. And then you still have this mana rock in play that didn't get blown up by Boom Bust. And so I think that this package is pretty interesting. Price, Wildfire, Boom Bust, Tablet. And I'm interested in exploring it. Definitely in a deck with a lot more instants and sorceries, but I think this is really cool. And don't remind me to do this because there's so much to do I might forget. I like the green Emeritus of Abundance, 3 mana, 3/4, enters prepared. The prepared spell cast is Regrowth. This card I think is just kind of okay to cast early. Like it's a 3 mana, 3/4, doesn't die to Flage. The Vigilance is really nice against Boros and Prowess, doesn't die to Bolt. And early you could just kind of buy back your best thing. You need a land, you need to get back Solitude, you need to get back Ending. It's okay. It's the stats on this card are a big part of this card being okay. But what's also nice about this is that it comes down. It's likely kind of a slower 2-for-1. But if you get to the late game with it, when you attack, if you control 8 or more lands, it becomes prepared again. So potentially you can regrowth every single turn. This is very good with stuff like Solitude, very good with just, grinding out your opponent. But you can also just go infinite with either Time Warp. So you go like attack, regrowth through Time Warp again. Or you can like get back Orm's Chant on your opponent's turn. So it's kind of like Eternal Witness Ephemerate in the sense that it's going to win the game with either Time Warp or Orm's Chant, but you don't need Ephemerate to do that, but you have to get to the late game with 8 lands. That being said, this card is also not bad with Ephemerate. You can Ephemerate this to reset the regrowth, and it is going to be more mana intensive, but we'll see how much. I think the 3/4 versus 2/1 on Witness versus Emeritus, I think it does matter a lot. This just is a format with like Bolt and Flage in it, and Ragavan, and one. A 3/4 is a pretty good blocker, weirdly enough. So I like this card. It's unlikely to be a big deal. It's kind of likely maybe even to be not that good, but I think every once in a while I'll try a shell that will kind of include this, if that makes sense. Follow the Lumerets is probably the best card that I'll probably never cast. It's a 2 mana sorcery. Look at the top 4 cards of your library, reveal a creature or land, and put them into your hand. It's kind of like a Malevolent Rumble, although you're more restricted on what you can get. But if you gained life, you get 2 things. Getting 2 things on this is crazy, and like it does play pretty well in the Guide of Souls Ocelot Pride deck. That being said, if I'm looking for like a green colorless 2-drop in Guide Pride decks, I'm probably playing Burning Ritual or Rumble over this. Maybe not. Maybe this takes the place of a Rumble and those kind of brews. And you definitely don't really build a deck around this so much as you just kind of incidentally are playing it. And I just don't know that I will ever reach for this card. But this card is really powerful if you can consistently turn on the infusion. Zimone's Experiment is kind of a nice tool for like red-green Valakut, which is not a very good archetype in Modern right now. It's a 4-mana sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. It can reveal up to 2 creature or lands from among them and put them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom in a random order. And then all lands revealed this way go into the battlefield tapped. So every once in a while, I'll kind of feel like I need some speed in red-green Valakut, and I look at these like 4-mana put some lands into play cards, and these cards do curve really well if you go 2-drop Accelerant into 4-mana put 2 lands into play. All of a sudden on turn 4 you're set up to like maybe win the game. The problem is playing these cards, you are like top decking a bunch of air, right? You're just top decking more cards that put lands into play. You have nothing to do. But this card can find you action. This card can find Primeval Titan, Ice Till Explorer, Dryad of the Elysian Grove. You know, just it can put value creatures in your hand. And so it's interesting to me that like this is like the first of these effects that lets you find action, and potentially finding this action is like a missing piece for this formula to just reduce mana flood, which I have felt like is an issue for like the red-green Valakut archetype. Unlikely going to be something that brings the archetype back, but maybe with a tool or 2 extra, we could see it come back. Amidst all the cool instants and sorceries, the prepared creatures, there's also just one big boy. This is Slumbering Trudge, a 1-mana 6/6 that you can also spend X mana when you cast it. It enters the battlefield with a number of stun counters equal to 3 minus X. So for 4 mana, this is a 6/6. And then for 1 mana, this is a 3/3 with 3 stun counters. And I don't know that you're going to cast this card for like 2 or 3 mana very often. I guess sometimes you will. But for the most part, I think this is going to be a 1-mana 6/6 enabler in the early game, and then a 4-mana 6/6 just if you top deck it. And a 1-mana 6/6, it kind of does a lot of interesting stuff. I haven't done like the most in-depth digging on what you could possibly do with this. I've done a couple Scryfall searches, but I don't feel like I've completely brewed with this card yet. But I do think that we're going to be casting it some. So like one of the more obvious things you can do is you can tap Fanatic of Rhodas. You can use this to tap to Fanatic, or let Fanatic of Rhodas tap for 4 mana. And maybe you just play like 1 Slumbering Trudge as a green sun target. Unfortunately, if you green sun into it, it still gets the -1 counters. But it could be just a 1-up to let your Fanatics tap for 4. You could also go play Slumbering Trudge and then sacrifice it to Life's Legacy. So this is draw cards equal to sacrifice creature's power. So 2 mana, draw 6, but you have to use 2 cards, and like really 3 mana over 2 turns. Kind of seems powerful. I don't know how you do, like what you would do with that exactly, but one thing that seems to kind of complement that idea of Life's Legacy, maybe Fanatic and Slumbering Trudge, is this card, the Skull Spore Nexus. It's a 8-mana artifact. It costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power amongst creatures you control. So it costs 6 less to cast after your 1-mana 6/6. So you can play this 8-mana artifact on turn 2. So you can play this 6/6, and then you have this turn 2 Skull Spore Nexus. And it says, whenever 1 or more non-token creatures you control die, you make a fungus dinosaur with base power and toughness equal to the power of those creatures. And then it can also double creatures' power. So you could like play the Trudge and then double its power with the Nexus, sack it to Life's Legacy, draw 12 cards, and then have a 12/12 fungus. Very weird stuff. Very, very weird stuff. But it all feels like something you should try to do in Modern. It's something you should try to do in Modern. So I'm going to do a deeper dive and find other ways to abuse a 1-mana 6/6. This is, I don't know, I should say this. This is far bigger than any 1-mana creature you can play on turn 1 in Magic the Gathering. And that's just like so interesting in this set that's just so full of stuff that isn't like this at all. You could also like Fate Transfer. So you can play this turn 1 and then you can move all the stun counters on one of your opponent's creatures. And then Fate Transfer, it also works with Moonshadow, moves the -1 counters. So that's kind of interesting that these are both 1-mana creatures that work with Fate Transfer. Could see that happening. Kind of interesting. Either way, going to be very, 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 very fun card to brew around. Ark of Hunger, I'm having kind of a hard time evaluating. It's a 4-mana artifact. it says whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, you deal your opponent 1 damage and you gain 1 life. And you can tap it to mill a card, and you can play that card this turn. So if you do play the card, you drain your opponent for 1. This card reminds me of the One Ring in that it is a 4 mana artifact that you tap for card advantage. Now, I'm not saying this card is really in the same realm as the One Ring, but it is kind of interesting that the One Ring is a 4 mana card advantage artifact that loses you life. And this isn't a 4 mana artifact that deals your opponent damage and gains you life. There might be something here. I think it's kind of interesting to pair with Flage, where you get to fill your graveyard for Flage. Obviously, these are the same colors. With Ketrimos, like the life gain on this helps offset the damage from Ketrimos to some extent, and then these two cards kind of like the same thing. So like Relic of Progenitus, Psychic Frog, just ways to like get cards out of the graveyard. So like potentially if you're playing like a deck full of Relics or Ketrimos and you have like 1 or 2 Ark of Hungers, all of a sudden you'll go like tap Relic, drain you for 1. Exile Relic, drain you for 1. Play another Relic, do it again. It seems like that could be kind of interesting. And then, Frog also, you can like activate it, trigger the Ark, although the colors are kind of sus there. So I think the card's kind of interesting. It's going to be in like your Mardu and kind of your bigger red-white decks. Maybe you could play like a one-of copy in Domain Zoo. Territorial Kavu does also trigger this. I think it's kind of interesting. Pretty unique effect as well. I'll definitely try it in a list or two. Pretty minor. Postmortem Professor, 2 mana 2/2, can't block. When it attacks, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life, and you can spend 2 mana to exile an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard and return it from the graveyard to the battlefield. I mostly think that this is a pretty good enabler for Prized Amalgam, and that's kind of it. I mean, maybe Prized Amalgam decks are just pretty bad and goofy, but I just could see myself playing some copies of this in like exactly Crabvine. I guess Dredge maybe too, but for the most part, I kind of just view Crabvine as the Prized Amalgam deck, and it's not so good. Pretty minor. Over like the last like 1 week, I've been really interested in Badgerable Cub plus Chthonian Nightmare. You get to go like turn 2 Badgerable Cub, your opponent kills your cub, and then you play Nightmare, you sack the land you Earthbent onto, and then you Earthbend onto a new land, and you tap it for 2 mana, you play the Nightmare, recurrent the Chthonian Nightmare again, which has been kind of an interesting loop. We had a trophy with it. It was pretty interesting. And so that deck building journey has kind of got me interested in this new card, Cauldron of Essence. It's a 3 mana artifact. It says whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So it just has like a Blood Artist effect stapled onto an artifact, which is kind of nice because the Blood Artist effect is pretty powerful, but it's kind of kept in check because Blood Artist is like a teeny tiny fragile creature, and this is harder to deal with. And you can spend 3 mana to sacrifice it, to sacrifice a creature and return a different creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is basically Recurring Nightmare, a very classic cube, older format card. It's a little bit before my time, but this is 3 mana, sack a creature, return a creature to play, then it goes to your hand. So basically it's, three mana every turn, loop once. And so like this ability is better against counter spells. This can, I guess, be activated twice in 1 turn in the late game. And so it's like, one thing with Cauldron of Essence is you don't get that reanimation immediately, which is a huge problem. That's really bad. But you do get a Blood Artist effect. That's pretty good, especially on this effect. So I have some weird decks that want to use this, like Badgermole Cub, Ice Till Explored, Ouroboros decks. Like really goofy, strange stuff. So I'm excited to try this. I don't really have high hopes for it, but I think this is like, it's a very cool card that's really interesting. And I don't think it's going to be quite powerful enough, but it is like just weird enough to try because it's a difficult card to evaluate. This card makes me pretty sad. I feel like I would have been really excited for Dina's Guidance, like post MH2 maybe. It's a 3 mana instant. You can search your library for a creature card, reveal it, and you can put it into your graveyard or the hand. So it's kind of a charm. It's either an Entomb or an Aladomri's Call, but it costs 3 mana. What's interesting about this card is this is the cheapest instant speed effect in Modern to entomb a creature into the graveyard. There's really only like 4 options. There's Unmarked Grave, which is a 2 mana sorcery, but you can't put a legendary creature in the graveyard. There's Buried Alive. It's a sorcery, but you can put 3 things in the graveyard. And then there's Gifts Ungiven, which is a blue card that can entomb some stuff too. I think it's really cool that your Entomb can also put a card in your hand, especially with how many like good grindy value cards there are. Like this could get you a Quantum Riddler. This could get you a Psychic Frog. This could get you a Superior Spider-Man to get back Deceit. This could get you Deceit. It's like, if your opponent has Graveyard Hate, you just cast this and you get a value creature. And I think that that dynamic is pretty cool. Do I think that this is going to be good enough for modern Reanimator decks? I don't. I think that this is a Faithless Looting format now. It's just so hard to spend mana to not impact the board. But I think it's like, it just sucks because it's close. And it would have been good enough, I think, like 3 years ago. I'm having a hard time with this card, Conciliator's Duelist. Black, white, white, 4/3 core warlock. When it enters, you draw a card, then each player loses a life. So it's always nice when your 4-mana creature just has an ETB draw a card. So if it dies to removal spell, you at least get a 2-for-1. And it has this really cool ability. Whenever you target an instant or sorcery spell that targets a creature, you get to flicker something. Flicker until the next end of turn. So like a Flicker Wisp, but not a Cloud Shift. This kind of doubles up your ephemerates. If you target one thing with ephemerate, you get to target something else, and it comes back end of turn. That seems very powerful as like an engine. And then additionally, whenever you're casting just like a Fatal Push on your opponent's thing, you could like flicker this to draw a card, or you could just flicker a Solitude, exile something else. And black-white decks in Modern are flicker decks. They're flicker decks that play spot removal. And so I could see myself, if I was going to play like an Ephemerate, Felia, Orzhov deck, I could see myself playing some copies of Conciliator's Duelist. It definitely seems like one to try out. I do think that there are some reasons to stay just black-white over splashing for Quantum Riddler, although this card is not as good as Quantum Riddler. So this is Fix What's Broken. 4-mana sorcery. As an additional cost to cast the spell, pay X life. You return each artifact and creature card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield. I'm probably reading too much into this, but to me this feels like they're speaking to me. Wizards are speaking to me, and this is Fixed Second Sunrise. Maybe that's not what they're saying, but that's how I'm interpreting this art. Art is subjective anyways. And I think it's still broken. I don't think it really works. When I first read this, I thought you got to return X or less. And I had this beautiful vision of going, oh, I'm going to pay 1 life, and I'm going to bring back all my chromatic stars and spheres and lotus blooms. I'm just going to keep looping them. I'm going to find Faith's Reward and Fix What's Broken. But it's X. So you can only return like all of your 1s or all of your 0s. For that kind of shell. And I don't know that you would really ever try this card outside of like an egg style deck, at least in Modern. I mean, maybe like if you were like, there's better effects for this to like return creatures. There's like 4 mana, return all creatures mana 2 and 1 back to play. I mean, I don't really think you're gonna want to try to like return like 2 Archons of Cruelty by paying 8 life, although that does sound pretty sick now that I said it. Yeah, I think, although, okay, hold on. What if you go turn 3 Buried Alive, put 3 Archon of Cruelties into play, then pay 8 for this? I mean, it's just slow. You're probably just dead paying 8, and you're so weak to Graveyard Hate. I don't think that this card is going to do much in Modern right now, but I think it could possibly do something one day. Like if there's ever like a 0 mana like sacrifice, like if there's like ever like another Mishra's Bauble, which they probably won't ever be, I could see like chaining this and Lotus Blooms with those baubles together maybe. Hardened Academic, 2 mana, 2/1 flying haste. You can discard a card to give this card lifelink until end of turn, and then whenever 1 or more cards leave a graveyard, you can put a counter on any creature you control. Very, very weird ability. I think one of the cooler things you can do with it is trigger Improv Bones. So your Improv Bones exile something from the graveyard. That triggers your Academic, which puts a counter on the Emperor, so you just get to buy that thing back. So that's a way for you to just use Improv Bones over and over every turn for 0 mana. And it's also a discard outlet for Emperor. So you can go Emperor, Academic, discard whatever you want to reanimate. I think that by itself is enough to like try that kind of shell in Modern. Now, do you want to be like a bigger Mardu Reanimator deck? We had like this Mardu Kalia Gorios deck that I always thought was a little underrated. This could kind of serve well there because it also had like a mid-range Flage backup plan. Do you want to play it in like a Mardu Ocelot Pride deck, and this has lifelink for Pride, and it can also like trigger your new Scheming Silvertongue, and then putting counters on Silvertongue is pretty good. There's also some like Agatha's Soul Cauldron stuff going on. I probably should have had that card up, although we all know what that card does. But just it's a discard outlet for Cauldron. And when you tap Cauldron, you put a counter on something else. So you can go tap Cauldron and then put 2 counters on 2 different creatures, and then use their abilities. So a lot going on, with this card. And I guess I will say, I do like seeing a good Boros 2-drop that does not just slot into Boros energy super easy. Mathemagic's really great name, really fun card. It's blue XX. Target player draws 2 to the X power of cards. So for 2 mana, you can just cycle it, draw 1 card. That is a nice mode on this very otherwise clunky card. For 4 mana, you can draw 2, not a very good rate. And then it starts to get better, where for 6 mana, you're drawing 4. For 8 mana, you're drawing 8. But what's cool to me about this card is like it does cycle early. It's like a mid-game, okay card advantage. And it is also the cheapest way in the modern card pool to just win the game with a single card. Basically, and by win the game, I mean actually the game is over because I resolved this. For the most part, the only cards that do that in Magic without like weird situational, like cast this if your opponent's at 10 life, deal 10 damage. The only way to do that is with X spells. And so like Fireball, if your opponent has 20 life, costs 21 mana. But if they played Guide of Souls, it's going to cost 30 mana to kill your opponent. This costs 14 mana to win the game. If you spend 14 mana, you make your opponent draw 64 cards. And I just think that is noteworthy. It's almost never ever going to come up in your brews that this is the cheapest X spell to win the game with. But it's important that you know that it is, just in case it comes up, and or at least it's important for me. And so I'm telling you because maybe you guys just like having a card pool in your brain, like I do. And it is also cool that this is the cheapest way to just win the game immediately, while also being a card that cycles for 2 mana and can draw some other cards. I think it's interesting. Could be in some kind of like blue Tron build potentially as a finisher. Probably not. I wouldn't go too crazy with this. This is more of like a deck builder's toolkit style tool. Iggy Azalea, Mage Tower Captain, 2 mana 2/2. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you may tap 3 untapped creatures. If you do, copy the spell. I don't know what I'm doing with this card. It's pretty unique. It's pretty special having this cheap of a spell doubler. It's weird because it asks you to have both a bunch of cheap creatures and a bunch of instants and sorceries. And it also wants you to be playing a slower, grindier plan. Potentially we're copying stuff like Price of Freedom, Cleansing Wildfire, Stone Rain effects. Potentially we're copying burn spells. But I don't like that it's a legendary creature either, but it is interesting. I don't have a deck for you with it, but just it's not very high on my to-do list either. Prismari Charm is like good enough. You can surveil 2, draw a card. This is maybe good with Wandering Archaic. Deals 1 damage to each of 1 or 2 targets. Only 1 damage each. So you can go like Ragavan, the Ajani token, but then you flip a Ajani, Ocelot Pride, Bowmaster, kill like 2 emissary tokens. That's like okay. And you can also bounce a permanent to its owner's hand, which is also okay, although you're not super happy to do it for 2 mana. Totally fine. I think probably one that I will not play very often in an Izzet deck, but if I'm playing like a Born Oculus, or if I'm playing the new Archaic card, or if there's a lot of 1 toughness creatures, then this card ends up being good enough to put in like your Izzet control decks. Also, just kind of like fine, good enough. Silvertongue Charm can exile creature power 2 or less. This is pretty good removal, although I really dislike against prowess. Your opponents can save their creatures really easily, especially Slickshot Show Off. So that's kind of a dicey dynamic. I do like the 2 counters ability. I think this is going to be better than you think. Like putting 2 counters on your Guide of Souls to save it from Flage, putting 2 counters on your Ocelot Pride so it wins combat, putting 2 counters on your Emperor of Bones so you can trigger it is pretty nice. And it also drains your opponent for 3, which is going to be a nice way to sometimes close out games, sometimes steal the aggro, and it's kind of a good situational tool that you're going to use less often, but when it's good, it's going to be great. Quandrix Charm is also kind of mediocre. Counter a spell unless they pay 2. That is a nice tool. It's going to be your most used mode for sure. You can also destroy enchantments, killing Birthing Ritual, Urza Saga. There's a few other like weapons manufacturing. This is a nice to have removal for those. And it's also like a combat trick. Target creature has base power and toughness 5/5 till end of turn. This saves some of your stuff from red removal. The thing is, like, the only deck that could really play this right now is Simic Ritual, and I don't know how interested you are in something like this. You lose Shardless Agent when you start adding 2 mana counter spells to your deck, and That those lists are pretty full as is, but I think Simic Ritual players, I encourage you to try this out. It's an interesting tool. It might be more of a metagame decision if the Destroy Enchantment mode is more relevant, but for the most part, this is just like a kind of good enough card that doesn't really have many, if any, homes. Rapturous Moment is it's interesting. It's 6 mana, draw 3, discard 2, and then you make 2 blue and you make 3 red. It's 6 mana sorcery, but it's a combination card draw ritual, which is it's very rare. I can't even think of a single besides like Manamorphose, a card that like makes mana and draws card at the same time. It's very, very rare. And if you have a Ruby or a Ral in play, this card is basically 0 mana, draw 3, discard 2. It discard 2. And then if you have like a Ral and a Ruby or 2 Rubies, then it is mana positive. And so I think that is interesting. I would encourage Storm players to give it a go. Being 6 mana just might be way too behind the curve. Like when you go Reckless Impulse or Rinse Resolve and you hit this early, you just can't cast it. That's a problemo. Maybe somehow it's a good wish target, but it's super unique, and I just think Storm players should like probably do like one league with this. Golgari gets a new sweeper option. It's kind of a weird mix of like Wrath of Sky's Culling Ritual. 4 mana, as an additional cost to cast a spell, pay X, and you destroy all artifacts and creatures with mana value X or less. So you can go a bit bigger than Culling Ritual. You can go big enough to kill Imri, Pinnacle Emissary, Flage, and get those off the field. Those kind of hard to get permanents. Paying a bunch of life stinks. Like Toxic Deluge has been a card that I think a lot of people thought would be like a big tool in Modern, but the life loss on a Boros Prowess metagame it's pretty tough. So I think you're going to see a similar dynamic with Vicious Rivalry. You'll probably just want to play non-painful sweepers, because painful sweepers against aggro decks is tough. Like against like weapons manufacturing, you're going to have to pay some life and then take damage from the munitions. Yeah, I don't think you're going to reach for this very often, but it's possible that the metagame converges in a place that this is just a better tool for you than Culling Ritual sometimes. Modern is a format that is full of good colorless utility lands that don't see any play. The Great Hall of the Biblioplex is better than that because it can tap for a color. So it's 1 mana colorless, or can tap for a colorless, or you can spend the life to add a mana of any color for instants and sorceries. And what's cool, it is cool. It turns into a permanent creature. It turns into a 2/4 wizard that gets +1 and 0 until end of turn when you cast instant or sorcery, and it still stays a land. But it stays also a creature permanently. Very weird card. I could see possibly playing this as like a 1 or 2 of in like a wizard's control deck. The life loss is definitely something that adds up a lot, so you don't want to play too many of them. But it is cool. It casts Counterspell. It doesn't hurt you for your Counterspell mana, and then eventually in the late game it turns into a win condition. And so I think this one does make the cut. I think it does make the cut in like specifically Wizards control, although Wizards has not been a very good archetype at the time of recording. It does get a bunch of new tools from this set, so we'll see. There was a little bit of time where I was playing some copies of Strategic Betrayal. Some other people were playing Strategic Betrayal as a way to deal with both Flage and Scion of Draco. So this is target opponent exiles a creature they control and their graveyard. So getting rid of the graveyard and also being an edict effect for Scion, pretty nice if both these cards are really popular. End of the Hunt, I think, is better. It says target opponent exiles a creature or planeswalker they control with the greatest mana value amongst creatures and planeswalkers they control. So one thing is it can get planeswalkers. So if you're main decking this and you're playing against Tron, you can get Ugin or you can get Karn or you can get Teferi or Narset out of control. Kind of minor, but maybe more relevant than you think. And then what's nice too is if you're playing against Leyline Scion, like if your opponent goes turn 1 Ragavan, turn 2 Scion, this gets the Scion, which is really important because sometimes Strategic Betrayal does not make them sack the Scion because they just have another creature. And then same thing with Flage. Like if you go Strategic Betrayal against Flage, if they just have another creature, they can sack something else. Although one big thing about this card is that you kind of make them exile the Flage from the graveyard and sack something else. But End of the Hunt just makes them sack the Flage. And this is also kind of nice too, like against a Johnny. Like Edict effects are kind of bad against Ajani, right? Because they sack the cat. But against Ajani, this makes them sack the Ajani itself because 2 mana value is greater than 0. So I think it's a pretty good tool for like Scion and Flage, and I think it's a bit more versatile in general. So if I wanted to play this card, which I haven't for like a little bit, but if I wanted to play this card, I would play End of the Hunt instead. I thought this idea was really, really cool, and I don't think it's gonna be modern playable. But I had a chatter on my stream recently who had a deck idea to play 4 copies of Page Looseleaf, a 2-mana 0/2 artifact creature that taps for a colorless, and you can when this is in play, you can discard another card named Page Looseleaf and reveal cards from the top of your deck till you reveal an instant or sorcery. So you could play Tron. The only instant and sorcery in your deck could be Kozilek's Command, and you could just like play this turn 2, and then you could just try to discard another one to tutor Kozilek's Commands. Kozilek's Command is broken. I think it might be the strongest card in Modern. For me, it's like either Kozilek's Command or Amulet of Vigor are like the 2 individually strongest cards in the format. And so playing like a 2-mana Mana Rock that just tutors more copies of Kozilek's Commands if you draw multiples, it is interesting. It might be better than I think, but I just think the fact that this dies so cheaply or so easily, I would just probably still rather play Mind Stone. Mind Stone also taps for a mana immediately. It can cycle later. I think that Mind Stone's still better, but I did just think that idea was so cool. I wanted to shout it out, and maybe you disagree with me. Maybe you think this idea is better, and you'll give it a go in your Tron deck and prove me wrong. Pox Plague is very interesting. It's like big Pox. 5 mana, each player loses half their life, then discards half the cards in their hand, sacrifice half the permanents they control, and you round down each time. I would be kind of interested in building a deck around this if Ocelot Pride and Ajani didn't exist. Maybe one day these cards won't be in the format, but these like big edict effects, while these cards are so dominant, they're just kind of a non-starter for me. I know a lot of people are excited about this one, so I wanted to talk about it, but too many cats. Moment of Reckoning is like crazy. I can see this target non-land permanent from your graveyard to the battlefield. It's just like, I just don't know how you ever lose if you play this card. It seems so absurd to me. Now, the problem is in Modern, there's no good way to cheat out a big instant or sorcery. There's good ways to cheat out permanents. There's not good ways to cheat out instants and sorceries. So I would love to cast this card. It's like, it is just bananas. I do think 7 mana is too much when you can't like cheat it out very well with Tron. Maybe you could play this in like a white-black Cabal Coffers deck. Double white is still kind of asking a lot, but it is kind of interesting. I'll say that this is a card that it's good to know, because if there ever becomes like a Mixix Mastery or whatever that card's called, like something like that like lets you cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard without paying its mana cost cheaply. And to my knowledge, this doesn't exist, at least efficiently in Modern. If there is something I just don't know about, let me know, because I would love to play with this card. But just know that this card exists, because this is one of the best things to cheat into play with it. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I know this video was super duper long. I mean, I'm just so excited for this set. I can't stress how refreshing it is to have a set that's just so full of like cool creatures, cool instants and sorceries, really thought-provoking build-arounds that all just look so fun. This set looks so fun. I don't know the last time I felt this way about a Magic the Gathering set. I think I'm more excited for this set than I have ever been for a standard set. I am more excited for this set than I was for Edge of Eternities. Edge of Eternities ended up being my favorite set ever. I do really like the space setting of Edge of Eternities. I did recently read Name of the Wind and A Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. So I am kind of on a Magic University kick. But even still, I don't know. I just love this set. I'm so excited for it. It feels so refreshing. I feel like this picture right here. The first set I ever played was Return to Ravnica, and it was a set full of 2-color guilds, charms, lots of just, I don't know, that set was so interesting to me in a very similar way this set was. And I feel very nostalgic for the design here. And I'm so excited to start brewing with these cards. I'll be over at twitch.tv/aspiringspike with new Strixhaven decks every weekday for the foreseeable future. It is going to take us a long time to get through them, and I'm so excited for them. I hope you are too. I'll see you there. Bye.